Welcome to Faith Wonders, where real stories of faith and miracles come alive from around the world.
What would you do if, just as you were preparing to lift a plane full of families into the sky, you saw a woman calmly walking across the runway? A woman in a light blue dress, a white veil floating around her face, moving with a serenity that defied all logic. And what if the control tower swore again and again that the runway was completely empty? This is not a legend from centuries ago. It is the story of a modern miracle of the Virgin Mary, one that unfolded not in a quiet chapel or a remote mountain village, but on the asphalt of Madrid's busiest airport. A miracle that saved 176 lives, and that forever changed the heart of a man who had spent his whole life denying faith. His name was Alejandro Ruiz. Alejandro was 45 years old, a veteran of the skies, a man who had accumulated over 14,000 flight hours on both military and commercial aircraft. For years, he had been recognized as one of the most competent captains at Iberia Airlines. If you asked his colleagues to describe him in one word, many would have said, rational. He was meticulous, precise, almost mathematical in the way he lived his life. He had served in the Spanish Air Force for nearly a decade, flying fast, unforgiving fighter jets. It was in those years that Alejandro had trained his mind to distrust emotions and instinct. For him, safety came from checklists, training, and discipline, never from prayer, never from faith. At home, things were different. His wife, Isabella, carried a deep Catholic faith. For 17 years, she had quietly knelt every morning and evening to pray for her husband and their children. She never forced her beliefs on Alejandro, but she lived them. She would light candles for his safety before each flight. She whispered Hail Marys when he called from airports around the world, and she prayed with their children at night, always including, "God protect Papa in the sky." Alejandro respected her devotion, but he never joined. To him, faith was a kind of poetry for people who needed comfort, but it was not reality. His children, however, were pulled between their parents' worlds. Miguel, 13 years old, wanted to follow in his father's footsteps, dreaming of cockpits and engines. He adored science and could spend hours reading aviation manuals. Lucia, just 9, had a softer, more imaginative soul. She would often ask her father questions like, "Papa, do you ever see angels above the clouds?" Alejandro always laughed gently and explained how ice crystals reflected the sunlight, or how air currents shaped the clouds into forms that children could imagine as angels. Yet somewhere deep inside, even he felt touched by her innocent wonder.
That Saturday morning in March, Alejandro's day began as it always did. The alarm rang at 4:30 a.m., and with military precision he rose from bed. Isabella was still asleep, her rosary on the nightstand, the beads tangled from her late-night prayers. Alejandro paused for a moment, glancing at her peaceful face. He never admitted it out loud, but her faith sometimes unsettled him. It was so steady, so confident, like a light in the dark that refused to go out. Downstairs, the kitchen was silent, except for the sound of the coffee machine. Alejandro always drank his first espresso exactly at 4:40. While sipping, he reviewed the flight plan on his tablet. Madrid to Barcelona, then onward to Rome. A simple route he had flown dozens of times. The weather report was flawless. Clear skies, calm winds, visibility unlimited. A pilot's dream. By 5:10 a.m., Alejandro was dressed in his crisp Iberia uniform. Isabella, awakened by habit, came downstairs in her robe.
Morning.
"Coffee is ready," he said with a small smile, pouring her a cup.
Good morning.
"Thank you, mi amor," she replied. Her voice was gentle, yet her eyes carried something Alejandro had seen many times: quiet concern. She reached for his hand, squeezing it between hers. "As always, I will pray for your safety today." Alejandro kissed her forehead but gave no reply. Inwardly, he thought what he had always thought: "I don't need prayers. I need discipline and proper maintenance." Their children were still asleep. Miguel's model airplanes lined his desk upstairs. Lucia had fallen asleep hugging a stuffed angel someone had given her at her first communion. Alejandro quietly opened their doors, watching them breathe in their dreams. For a moment, his stoic mask softened. He loved them fiercely, even if he showed it more in action than in words. By 5:25 a.m., Alejandro was on the road to the airport. Madrid's streets were nearly empty except for delivery trucks. In the stillness of dawn, his mind was already rehearsing the flight. Fuel levels, runway assignments, departure altitude, alternate routes. He was like a chess player, planning moves 10 steps ahead.
At 6 a.m., in the crew briefing room, he met his co-pilot for the day, Carlos Herrera, a 33-year-old first officer with 8 years of experience. Carlos was Alejandro's opposite in many ways. Relaxed, warm, and quietly religious, Carlos often carried a small medal of the Virgin Mary in his flight bag. He never flaunted it, but Alejandro had noticed once during a long-haul flight when turbulence hit, and Carlos had instinctively touched the medal before adjusting the controls. "Buenos dias, Captain," Carlos greeted, extending a hand. His documents were perfectly organized, his smile easy. Alejandro nodded, appreciating the man's professionalism. They reviewed the flight plan together. Carlos mentioned the usual: passenger count, weather updates, alternate airports. Everything was in order. At 6:15, they walked across the tarmac toward the waiting Airbus A320. The aircraft stood gleaming under the pale light of morning, its fuselage freshly cleaned, the Iberia logo glowing red and yellow. Ground crews were finishing the fueling. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the cool air. Alejandro paused, as he always did, for his personal ritual, a full external inspection. Walking slowly around the aircraft, he checked the landing gear, wings, flaps, and tail. Every detail had to be perfect. Carlos followed the internal checklists inside the cockpit, switching on systems, aligning navigation equipment. By 6:30, Alejandro stepped into the cockpit and slid into his seat. The familiar environment surrounded him: the panels of instruments, the faint hum of electronics, the rows of switches. It felt like home. Together, he and Carlos moved through the pre-flight checklist, their voices alternating like a well-practiced duet. Battery switches on? Checked. Fuel pumps on? On. Flight plan confirmed? Confirmed. Meanwhile, in the cabin, 176 passengers were boarding. Families with children, business travelers, an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary. Ordinary lives, trusting that these two men would carry them safely across the skies. At 6:45, the aircraft doors were closed. Alejandro radioed the tower. "Barajas ground, Iberia 432, request pushback and start clearance." "Cleared to push, Iberia 432. The rumbling of the engine starting filled the cockpit, a vibration Alejandro knew by heart. He always felt a thrill in that moment, the transformation of metal into life, of stillness into motion. As the tug pushed them back, Alejandro checked the instruments. All green, all perfect. He should have felt his usual calm satisfaction. But that morning, something was different. It began as a subtle sensation, like a warmth filling the air around him. Not nervousness, not fear. Alejandro was immune to those after so many years. This was something stranger, a serenity, a presence he could not name.
as though someone had quietly stepped into the cockpit with him. Carlos glanced sideways. "Captain, everything all right?" "Yes," Alejandro answered quickly, though his mind wrestled with confusion. He had never, in all his years, felt anything like this. It was as though the air itself was charged with an invisible peace. He shook his head, forcing himself back into focus. He had a plane to fly, lives to protect. He did not believe in feelings. At 6:58 a.m., they reached the holding point near the runway. Alejandro called the tower. "Tower, Iberia 432, ready for takeoff." The reply came. "Iberia 432, hold short, traffic crossing." They waited. Alejandro's hands rested on the thrust levers, steady, practiced. He watched another aircraft land in the distance. Everything unfolded as it always did. Yet the strange peace lingered, and with it came something else. A faint, almost imperceptible hesitation in his heart. It was then, in those silent minutes before clearance, that Alejandro Ruiz, the man who had never once in his life prayed before a flight, felt for the very first time that something beyond his control was about to happen.
The engines roared, steady and confident, their vibrations coursing through the cockpit. For most pilots, this was the most exhilarating part of the job, the moment just before being released onto the runway, where every sense focused, every nerve sharpened. But for Captain Alejandro Ruiz, something was different that morning. He should have been running mental checklists, focusing on takeoff thrust settings, departure procedures, and climb gradients. Instead, his mind circled back to that strange calm that had descended on him like a blanket. Not nerves, not fear, something else, something otherworldly. It clung to him, almost tangible. Carlos glanced over, his young face lit by the glow of the instrument panel. "Captain, you're unusually quiet. Everything all right?" Alejandro cleared his throat. "Just focused." But inside, he was unsettled. Pilots didn't speak of feelings in the cockpit. Feelings were irrelevant, dangerous even. You trusted numbers, not instincts. And yet, as the tower cleared them onto the runway, Alejandro advanced the throttle slightly, guiding the Airbus forward to line up. The massive machine rolled, its nose aligning perfectly with the strip of asphalt stretching endlessly ahead, glowing under the morning light. "Runway 25 right, cleared for takeoff," the tower's voice came through the headset. "Cleared for takeoff, Iberia 432, Alejandro replied automatically. His hand rested on the throttles, ready to push them forward. He had done this motion thousands of times, a movement so ingrained it was almost muscle memory. Normally, he would feel an adrenaline surge, a laser focus. But this time, his hand hesitated. His eyes narrowed, scanning the runway. It was clear, perfectly clear. "Captain?" Carlos prompted gently. Alejandro forced himself to nod, gripping the controls tighter. "You're being ridiculous. Fly the airplane." "Setting takeoff thrust," he said firmly. He pushed the throttles forward and the Airbus surged ahead. The engines thundered, the acceleration pressed them into their seats. The numbers climbed, 40 knots, 60 knots, 80 knots. Everything was normal, perfectly normal. And yet, with every heartbeat, the strange calm inside him grew stronger.
It was as if an unseen hand pressed lightly on his shoulder, urging him to wait. At 90 knots, Carlos called, "Speed checked." Alejandro's eyes flicked down the runway, and that was when he saw her. At first, he thought his eyes deceived him. A figure, impossibly out of place, was walking across the runway, slowly, gracefully, completely untouched by the roaring engines bearing down on her. She wore a long robe of pale blue, a white veil framing her face. Her steps were steady, her gaze serene. Her hands were folded at her chest as if in prayer. And though the Airbus was hurtling toward her at nearly 100 miles per hour, she did not move faster nor look afraid. She simply was. Alejandro's breath caught. His hands froze on the controls. "Captain, abort! Abort!" Carlos shouted into the radio. Alejandro slammed the throttles back and pulled the reverse levers. The Airbus screamed in protest, engines roaring as the massive jet fought against its own momentum. The cabin jolted, passengers gasped, overhead bins rattled. The entire aircraft shuddered as it slowed, tires screeching against the runway. "Tower, Iberia 432, aborting takeoff," Carlos barked into the radio. "Abort? Iberia 432, runway is clear." The controller's voice crackled in confusion. "There's nothing on the runway." But Alejandro knew what he saw. The figure, the woman in blue, stood right there, in the center of the runway, gazing directly at him. Her expression was calm, yet powerful. Her eyes seemed to pierce into the deepest parts of his soul. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone, vanished. Only empty asphalt stretched before them. Alejandro sat frozen, his heart pounding, his breaths ragged. The Airbus came to a trembling halt halfway down the runway. Silence filled the cockpit, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. Carlos turned toward him, eyes wide. "Captain, what did you see?" Alejandro couldn't answer. His throat was dry, words trapped. The tower's voice came again, insistent now. "A tower, Iberia 432, confirm reason for aborted takeoff. The runway is clear." Alejandro's hand trembled against the throttle. He couldn't say it. Not yet. How could he? But then, before he could respond, another voice broke through the radio. A different controller, urgent. "Tower, to all stations, alert. Unauthorized aircraft just entered airspace. Piper PA-28 with lost communications, crossing approach path of runway 25 right." Carlos's eyes went wide. He looked at Alejandro in disbelief. The small aircraft, unseen, unheard, and invisible to them in that critical moment, had just crossed directly into their takeoff path. If they had continued, if Alejandro had ignored that strange presence, 176 lives would have ended in an instant. Alejandro's chest tightened. His hands gripped the controls so tightly they shook. And deep within him, the cold walls he had built for decades began to crack.
The Airbus sat trembling on the runway, its engines idling after the violent stop. Passengers murmured anxiously in the cabin, some clutching armrests, others glancing nervously at the windows. No one understood why their flight had nearly taken off and then slammed to a halt. In the cockpit, silence reigned. Alejandro's hands were still on the throttles, white-knuckled, his pulse hammering. Carlos's voice broke the quiet. "Captain, if we had taken off..." He stopped, unable to finish the sentence.
Alejandro swallowed hard. "We wouldn't be here," he muttered. The tower confirmed the discovery of the unauthorized Piper crossing their departure path. The implications were devastating. A collision had been inevitable. Their aborted takeoff was the only reason they were alive. But Alejandro knew something more. He hadn't stopped because of a radar warning or because of air traffic control. He had stopped because of her, the woman, the lady in blue. As he sat there, staring down the empty stretch of runway, the strange fragrance returned. A delicate scent, like flowers he could not name, yet deeply familiar. The air in the cockpit seemed charged, alive. And then she appeared again. Not in the distance, not as a shadow, but clearly, unmistakably, standing just a few meters ahead of the nose of the Airbus. Her robe shimmered in soft light, pale blue flowing as if moved by a gentle breeze. The white veil framed her youthful face, serene yet filled with an undescribable authority. Her eyes, deep, endless, compassionate, locked on to Alejandro's. He froze. Every rational part of him screamed that this was impossible, that he was hallucinating, that stress, fatigue, or adrenaline had broken his mind. But no, this was not illusion. This was not dream. This was real. Carlos looked out confused. "Captain, what are you—" He broke off, staring at the same spot, his brow furrowed. I don't see anything." Alejandro barely heard him. His chest tightened as the lady raised one hand slowly, gracefully. And she blessed the aircraft. Her fingers traced the sign of the cross in the air, luminous and gentle. Peace swept over Alejandro like a tide, flooding every corner of his soul. The cockpit, moments ago tense with adrenaline, now felt like a sanctuary. Tears filled his eyes, something he had not felt since childhood. For decades he had prided himself on logic, discipline, self-reliance. But here in the presence of the lady in blue, all that melted away. For the first time in his life, Alejandro Ruiz, the skeptic, the atheist, the man of steel, whispered a prayer. "Madre de Dios, is it you?" The lady smiled softly. And in that instant, Alejandro understood. Her presence had saved them. Her warning had spared 176 lives. His wife's prayers had been answered in the most direct, undeniable way. The radio crackled again, tower voices busy, issuing new instructions, clearing the runway. But Alejandro no longer heard them. All he could see was the lady's gaze, and all he could feel was the certainty that he was no longer alone. Then, as gently as she had come, she faded. Her form dissolved into the golden light of morning, leaving only the fragrance of flowers lingering in the air. Alejandro sat back in his seat, trembling, tears sliding silently down his cheeks. Carlos stared at him. "Captain, what happened?" He turned slowly, voice hoarse but steady. "A miracle." That night, back in his home in Madrid, Alejandro sat at the kitchen table in silence. His uniform still hung neatly on the chair, untouched since he had returned. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Isabella placed a warm cup of tea in front of him. She had seen his face when he walked through the door, pale, shaken, yet strangely radiant. "Alejandro, she said softly, taking the chair beside him. Something happened. He nodded, his throat tight. I saw her, Isabella. The lady, on the runway. Her eyes widened, tears welling instantly. She reached for the drawer beside her, pulled out a small framed image and placed it on the table. It was the Virgin Mary, Our Lady of Grace, robed in pale blue, veil of white. Alejandro froze, his breath caught. It was her, exactly her. The same eyes, the same serenity, the same radiance. Isabella's voice trembled. This morning, I felt an urgency I couldn't explain. I prayed harder than I ever have. For you, for your flight. I asked Our Lady to protect you. Alejandro covered his face with his hands, tears slipping between his fingers. For the first time, the man who had once dismissed all faith as superstition broke down completely. She came, he whispered. She truly came. In the weeks that followed, Alejandro was never the same. He remained the skilled, disciplined pilot he had always been, but something deeper had changed. Before every flight, he now bowed his head in silent prayer, asking for the protection of the Blessed Mother. His colleagues noticed. "You've mellowed, Captain," Carlos once remarked. "It's like you carry a calm with you." Alejandro only smiled. He knew it was not his calm, it was hers. Miguel, his teenage son, listened wide-eyed as his father recounted the story. "So, you believe now, Papa? You believe in God?" Alejandro placed a hand on his son's shoulder, voice steady. "Yes, hijo, I believe, because I've seen." Little Lucia, with the innocent certainty of a child, added, "I always told you the angels fly with you." This time, Alejandro didn't correct her. He simply pulled her close and whispered, "You were right." The official report never mentioned the apparition. It only recorded that Iberia 432 aborted takeoff due to unidentified obstruction, and that a Piper PA-28 was later discovered crossing illegally into controlled airspace. But Alejandro, Isabella, and Carlos knew the truth. The Lady in Blue had intervened. It was a miracle. And so, dear friends, Alejandro's story reminds us that in a world governed by technology, procedures, and logic, there are still higher forces at work. The Virgin Mary continues to walk among us, protecting, guiding, and answering the prayers of those who call upon her. Sometimes her intervention is subtle, felt only as a whisper in the heart. Other times it is radiant and undeniable, as it was on that runway in Madrid. How many tragedies have been silently prevented by her hand? How many lives saved by the prayers of a mother, a spouse, or a child? Alejandro Ruiz, once a man of skepticism, now lives with unshakable faith. Because on that morning, he learned the truth. We do not fly alone through the skies of life. Our Lady walks with us, always. Now I want to invite you, dear viewer. Do you believe that the miracles of the Virgin Mary still happen today?
Have you, or someone you know, ever experienced her protection in a mysterious way? Share your testimony in the comments below. Your story may be the hope someone desperately needs to hear. And remember, every flight, every journey, every step of life, we are never alone. Ave Maria.